You guys recognize those two people in the picture at all? Just for a bit.
Perhaps the main light could go down.
Where you had it before the minute.
Ah, yes, that's better.
Still not very good.
Does anyone recognize, especially the guy on the left? That's your Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and the Minister of Defense, Peter MacKay, having fun in Afghanistan a few years ago. They seem to enjoy it. I always find those pictures funny. And the title of my talk is Nothing Accomplished, Our War in Afghanistan. Okay, so I take the title from the famous mission accomplished idea, right? And that comes from George Bush. He, on May 1st in 2003, about 6 weeks after the U.S. and coalition forces were in Iraq, President Bush landed on the USS Abraham Lincoln at sea, and he announced that my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed, and now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. He had a big mission accomplished banner behind him, and that has become known as the mission accomplished speech. But as we know, the war was to escalate shortly after, and in the end proved disastrous. The country of Iraq is now basically disintegrated into three sort of different unstable regions. Iraq itself is really not what it ever was before. And again, the U.S. is bombing Iraq, not to mention Syria. There's Bush in his jumpsuit when he landed on the aircraft carrier. And a lot of people don't know that the whole event was a public relations stunt. There were sort of claims that he flew in a jet, but he was flown in by a pilot. There were claims that they were far out at sea on this aircraft carrier, but it was just a few miles off of San Diego. And the media agreed to have their cameras not catch the skyline. And it's important to think about the fact that these events are staged, and there is quite a bit of spin in them to try to convince us that good things are happening. And that'll be a kind of tone that I use throughout. It turns out that, meanwhile, on the exact same day in Afghanistan, the Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, was giving a very similar speech. This was after 18 months of U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. Rumsfeld said, "We clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction." This was a full press conference with President Hamid Karzai at his side, and they talked about moving on to all of the good things that would occur in Afghanistan after May 1st, 2003. But we know that the two wars that arose from 9/11 were not effectively over in May 2003. It's completely false to say this. There's still significant conflict in both countries. In Afghanistan in particular, the conflict would simmer for about another year into 2004, and then from 2005 onward, it would get worse every year until about 2011-12, and it sort of stayed at that high level since then. That even involved a massive U.S. surge of 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, which failed to quell the insurgency. Now, there's a funny thing that I have to mention here that actually in November and December of 2001, we had the first instance where the Afghanistan war was declared to be over. I wrote this article for the Ottawa Citizen, I think it was in 2008, where I looked back at it. It was called 3 Short Months, 7 Long Years Ago. Got picked up by a number of newspapers. And in that article, I tried to show that really the terrorist attacks that happened on 9/11 happened September 11, 2001, and the UK and the US were bombing Afghanistan by October 7th. That's when the war began, less than a month after 9/11. And by November 13th, the Taliban in Afghanistan had largely fallen. They'd fallen in Kabul, they were on the run, and victory was widely being declared. This is November 13th, 2001. On December 5th, 2001, we had the Bonn Agreement, which was a conference in Germany to set the way forward for the stabilization and development of Afghanistan. And then on December 22nd, Hamid Karzai was sworn in as the interim president, and everyone was writing about how great Afghanistan would be in the near future. So 3 short months, 13 long years ago, we're not even close to that. I guess I want to say that we have to have some serious skepticism about these mission accomplished type pronouncements. Clearly all of them are laced with spin, and we should think about that even today as we listen to pronouncements about what has been accomplished in the country. Now people will say that certainly something has been accomplished, and I'm going to argue that nothing has been accomplished. And I'm going to take this to be a kind of a slogan, right? So mission accomplished itself was a slogan, and I know that a few things have been accomplished, but the slogan is designed to point us toward a kind of dominant state of affairs. And the dominant state of affairs in Afghanistan is failure, so I'm going to defend the slogan, nothing has been accomplished. Nothing accomplished. And I think, I hope by the end of this presentation, if you aren't already skeptical, I know many of you are, Science for Peace generally attacks people who are prone to be skeptical about these things. But if you aren't already skeptical, you'll be more so, and you'll pay attention to what's being said today about Iraq and Syria with equal skepticism. Take, for example, I mean, in the last couple of days, there have been serious announcements about airstrikes in Syria. We've been hitting Iraq for 4 to 6 weeks already. I know of reports from Syria of the bombs hitting children and civilians, and they're not going to do the job. You have to just think about the munitions. The military people know that when you drop bombs on insurgent positions, all they have to do is dig in. So in November and December, October and November of 2001, the Americans bombed the bejesus out of Afghan insurgent positions, and the Afghans just dug in and went into caves. The Taliban did, Taliban guys and Al-Qaeda, and they waited out the bombing. You only have to dig into the ground a little bit to avoid a bomb. A bomb seems like a horrible thing to us, but they largely blow outward. They don't blow downward as much as we think, so people dig in. And after the bombing runs were done the first few times in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban actually came out of their caves and jeered at the Northern Alliance and said, you know, America can't defeat us. In a way, they're right. In a way, they're right. The bombing runs will do little, but they will blow outwards and wipe out houses and any people in the vicinity. We need to be skeptical. So in 2001, we relied on a group called the Northern Alliance to take out the Taliban. They were largely remnants of warlords we supported against the Soviets. They were very nasty guys. Not a single one of them I would call progressive in any stretch of that word. And we relied on them. And we relied on them to do all of the dirty work on the ground to push the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. And then we became dependent upon them because they became the power brokers in the country. And so then we ended up with a country run by warlords who are pretty disreputable people. And so this is the same kind of scenario we'll face in Syria and Iraq, the same kind of scenario that will go on. It's not a solution. The second part of my title is Our War in Afghanistan. I mean, there's a serious sense that the war in Afghanistan is over. A few years ago, I'd give talks like this, and there'd be more people in the room. People now ask me why I keep going on about Afghanistan. Isn't it over? And I think that's right. There is a sense that it's over. But the conflict is not over. The violence has not gone down. The country is not stabilized. Development has not worked. At least that's what I'll try to show you. So in what sense is it over? It's over in the sense that we've turned away from it. The West has turned away. We're no longer as interested as we used to be. So really that means that it was our conflict in their country that we worried about for 13 years. Now we're less worried about it. We're worried about other things. And this is a serious issue, I'd like to say. We didn't really prosecute the war for them. It doesn't matter that it hasn't been completed. We are moving on for reasons of our own. In fact, we might say that one of the accomplishments of the war has been to spread radical Islam. Okay, so last year at about this time, the editors of Global Brief, a Canadian magazine about world affairs, asked me to engage in a debate with someone about this issue. And that's the sort of basic information I'm going to use, updated, to talk today about the accomplishments or lack of accomplishments in Afghanistan. And the person I was debating was a fellow named Dan Feita. The debate resolution was Afghanistan will be a source of global instability after 2014. And Mr. Fatah is a vice president at the Cohen Group. And the Cohen Group is a kind of major think tank in the United States in Washington, D.C. It's run by William Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense in Washington from 1997 to 2001. So what happens in American politics is a little bit different than Canadian politics. When the Republicans are in office, they drag a whole bunch of people into their bureaucracy from universities and think tanks. And then when they're out of office, all those guys have to go back to universities and think tanks. Works the same for the Democrats. So right now, a lot of these guys who were in the Pentagon during the Afghanistan war, etc., are now in think tanks, and Mr. Fatah is one of them. And he was a top advisor to Rumsfeld and Gates during the period of the war. He's no slouch. And I take him to be a serious guy. He's on the right wing. He's a serious guy. He's a nice guy. But he has views that are very different from my own. And so I like going back to the debate, actually, to bring out some of these issues, because then I'm having to make my position clear with respect to what the other side thinks. And that makes me have to work a little bit harder, rather than just saying war sucks. Nobody likes to hear that, even though it's true. So you try to refute the actual positions of the other side. And so my sort of view begins with the historical context. And really, we could go back to Alexander the Great, as everyone says, in talking about Afghanistan. There's a pretty good book on that by a guy named Tanner that goes through the whole military history of Afghanistan, but that would take a long time. So we'll start with the 19th century. In the 19th century, really, there was a struggle over Afghanistan, really, between the Russian bear and the British lion. So there's the leader of Afghanistan stuck between the bear and the lion. He says, "Save me from my friends." And the real issue there was India. India was the jewel of the British crown. It was a great moneymaker for Britain, a great source of prestige. But just a couple of countries north of India was the Russian imperial bear, and it had, it was looking down, thinking of maybe taking India, at least that's what the British thought. So in between was Afghanistan. So Afghanistan became this buffer zone, this place in which the British tried to make sure they could deal with the Russians if they ever tried to come into India. And so it's just a kind of zone in which they could use space to protect India. And that was unfortunate for the Afghans. Then if we come to the 20th century, especially after the World Wars, we enter the Cold War. And during the Cold War, it was no longer the British against the Russian Empire, it was the Soviet Union against the United States. Right? And the United States poured something like $80 million in that time's money into the U.S. Helmand Valley development. The historian Arnold Toynbee, who some of you have read, is an important historian, he went and visited, and he said, "The new world they're conjuring up out of the desert at the Helmand River's expense is to be an America in Asia." The United States poured tons of money into this area in order to secure Afghanistan against possible Soviet incursions. The Soviets were doing the same thing. They poured tons of money into Afghanistan. It was kind of a battle of development models. And there are stories of, them each building a road, the Russians from the north and the Americans from the south, and then meeting in the middle and getting drunk and talking about it. So there was sort of fun on the ground, but at the same time it was, at the heart of the Cold War, and it was thought to be an important issue to figure out, to get Afghanistan on your side. So what the Americans did is, this is one half of what they did. It's an old picture from the Journal of American History, but that is the Arghandab River Basin Dam, what we now call the Dalla Dam. It's a huge dam. You can't see it that well, but that sort of Z line is the dam. Behind it is the reservoir. And they built this huge dam and another one called the Kajaki Dam on the rivers in the Helmand Basin in order to try to turn the desert into a great fertile plain. Of course, there's a lot of work been done on this by a historian named Kulather, a great guy, Nick Kulather, and he's shown, looked through the documents and shown that many corners were cut. There were huge salinity problems, huge displacement problems, and the project largely didn't do what it was supposed to do. But this was a huge project that Americans wanted to do in order to stop the Soviets from possibly moving through Afghanistan, and then they would be one country, Pakistan, away from the seas. And that would give them a warm port near India, which, in geopolitics, if you've played Risk, that's apparently very important. I'm sure it is. There's a picture of it. so I don't know, this is Afghanistan sort of right around here, right? And the whole Helmand River Authority project covers the whole southern half of Afghanistan, more of it. See? It's a massive project for the time. And if we look at USAID reports from the time, we can see that the issue at the time was to increase US prestige, help the Afghans in order to get them to side with US interests rather than Soviet interests. Here's a picture of Prime Minister Harper visiting the Dalit Dam in 2009. During the conflict, the recent conflict, Canada spent $50 million refurbishing the Dalit Dam. It was one of our signature projects. Most people think that the work was never completed, and the project remains in limbo now. In the few months before Harper visited, 5 Canadian soldiers were killed in that area, 14 wounded, trying to establish security for his surprise visit. So the sort of struggle between Canada and the US, Russia and the US, the Soviet Union and the US, happened during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that led to a kind of catastrophe in 1979 where the Soviet Union actually fully invaded. And that's a picture of their invasion plan. They took over the country. This was the last major hot conflict of the Cold War. And between 1979 and 1989, while the Soviets were in charge of Afghanistan, the Americans and their friends in the area supported the Mujahideen, which were some kind of freedom fighters, warlords in Afghanistan who were willing to fight against the Soviets to take their country back. And that's who the West sort of funded to try to push the Soviets out over that 10-year period. We did manage to push the Soviets out. In 1989 they left. You know that this is about the same time that the Berlin Wall falls. All that's going on. So the Soviet Union really is hurt and running in a way. And we feel like we've won and we're triumphant in Afghanistan. So the West walks away from Afghanistan. And who's left there but the well-armed and well-funded Mujahideen warlords who then can't agree on who will run the country, so they have the worst civil war in Afghan history, and they fight over who will control the city. The country. And this is a picture of part of the city of Kabul after it's been bombed by various sides. They battle over the city. And many Afghans tell us that this was the worst part of their history, the period in which the Mujahideen warlords fought for control of the country. Now, out of this turmoil, civil war, lawlessness, disorder, destruction, there begins to develop a small group called the Taliban. It's one of their flags, and they get prominence by about 1996 and hold the country until 2001. Now, if you look at this map, this is Afghanistan here, and that orange blob is where the Pashtun people live. And you'll notice that there's a border, the southern border of Afghanistan runs right through where the Pashtun people live. This is the traditional lands of the Pashtun nation. And that border is there because in the very late 1800s, in the last decade of the 1800s, Sir Mortimer Durand drew the border for England right through there. And he did that on purpose. He wanted to weaken the Afghan state so it would never become a real political entity, so he could maintain it as a kind of buffer zone that the British could use against the Russians. And he also was a part of a group that extended the Afghan border, so it actually shoots out in a stick that's very narrow all the way to China here. That's Afghanistan. And that weird finger was there so that the Russians could never touch India physically. And this is Pakistan, of course, but back then Pakistan was a part of India. So it was all an attempt to use this in-between ground to stave off the Russian bear. Of course, this is like an unimaginably undoable border because it goes right through the tribal homelands of the Pashtun people. It's very undeveloped, mountainous, etc. So to try to, maintain some kind of border control there is just going to be pointless, which has led to many of the problems in the Afghan war that we're recently going through. Push the wrong button. Of course, once the Taliban took over with their kind of very basic code that mixes in Pashtun sort of views plus also their sort of violent Islamic ideology, they sort of established a place in which a group like Al-Qaeda could take hold. So there's Osama, and he was in Afghanistan a number of times before he set up base there, and it is thought that from those bases some of the planning was done for the 9/11 attacks, which happened on September 11th, 2011. That, of course, led to Bush, the single remaining superpower, to begin a war that is now more than 13 years old in that country. We could say that the Taliban was bad. Certainly many people greeted it with open arms when it first took over, because they were in a situation where the civil war was destroying the country. And there was a kind of harshness of establishing order by the Taliban that people liked. But of course they soon didn't like that, because it was much harsher than anyone wanted. So the Taliban was bad, is bad, but war is also very bad. And so the first thing I would say is, in essence, all we've done is replace one bad with another. And that's not much of an accomplishment. The war grew. I mean, many people have argued that by beginning this war, we began it in Afghanistan, but it immediately spread to Pakistan. So the drone war in Pakistan is a direct result of this. I would argue that it is an inspiration to a lot of the problems. It's an inspiration to the Arab Spring in a way that we don't like to think about. We like to think about the Arab Spring as people throwing off authoritarian rule, but it also is a kind of radicalizing force for people who are strongly attached to certain radical forms of Islam to say no to America, to say no to colonialist regimes like Mubarak in Egypt. And so it has led to some of these things, partly in ways we like, but partly in ways which have turned out to be extremely problematic. And we know it has also spread to places like Yemen and Syria and things like that. So in one way we could say that the war on terror really has maybe expanded the terrorist threat, which is very unfortunate. Not a great accomplishment. NATO stepped in and took the lead. Even the United Nations stepped in. The ISAF forces in Afghanistan are under the United Nations and NATO in a kind of complicated relationship. And I would say they've both dirtied their hands in this conflict. And our hands are very dirty. The pictures of torture, etc., have come out of the wider conflict. And I think it's extremely unfortunate that the sort of peacekeeping model and all of those things that we've talked about for many years in this country was not used, and rather we've got our hands dirty and we've picked sides, and it hasn't worked. This is a current spokesperson for ISIL, or ISIS as they get called recently, and he recently put out a statement that you've probably seen in the media. I think it came out a few days ago. He said, he's talking to Muslims in places like Canada. He says, if you kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, or an Australian or a Canadian, or any other disbeliever from the disbelievers waging war, including the citizens of the countries that entered into a coalition against the Islamic State, kill him in any matter, however it may be. So the threat of terrorism has not gone down, it's been increased. So now to my opponent's four main arguments. That's a bit of a historical background. My opponent, Mr. Fatah, who was in the Secretary of Defense's office in the Pentagon during most of the Afghan war, advances four main arguments for the fact that something has been accomplished in Afghanistan. And the first argument is that Afghans will defend the significant accomplishments made, especially technological, material, communications progress. That kind of stuff has been made in Afghanistan. He thinks the Afghans will defend that, so there's going to be a movement ahead. He says that the West will continue to support the mission, and that will bring more accomplishments. We'll put in more money, more military support, and more good things will come. He says that there is now sufficient investment and economic development, and that's going to generate even more accomplishments. And he says that there are democratic processes in the country that may mature around the 2014 presidential elections. That would be a major accomplishment, and news about that is leaking out daily now. An agreement was reached just 2 or 3 days ago. So I'll try to talk about that. The first one. Is it true that the Western intervention, now 13 years, tons of money, has brought any kind of advance, progress, accomplishment to Afghanistan such that Afghans themselves would consider defending that against the insurgency themselves? That's the question, and I say I don't think so. So let's just look at the UN Development Project Human Development Index. So this is a measure that the UN does where they do a calculated analysis of statistics from the country looking at education, welfare, economics, a whole range of things, equality, inequality, gender imbalances, and they come up with a number, a kind of a score, and they give it to each country. And the most recent numbers, again, put Norway at the top. So throughout the world, Norway is the country with the greatest amount of positive human development. It gets an A+. 94 is an A+. Canada gets a 90, which is still an A+, even at Trinity. And that's a good thing. The world average is a 70. What's that, a B-? We never see such things at Trinity. Now, Afghanistan is an area, South Asia, and that area, all the countries, the average they get is 58, which is a D something. Now, Afghanistan is also in the category of countries that score in the lowest category. There are 4 categories: high, average, middle, low, or something. But in the lowest category of Human Development Index numbers, there are these countries, Afghanistan one of them, and the average there is 49. So Afghanistan itself scores 47. So it's in the lowest category and is below the average. And we might think that that's a lot to defend, but it doesn't sound like a lot to defend to me. Afghanistan's HDI is 169th out of 187 countries in the world. It's in the bottom 10%. And this is after 13 years of expensive Western intervention. That's all we could manage. The bottom country currently is Niger with a score of 34. At least we're better off than that. Here are the numbers over time from 1980 until about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So the top number is the world average, and it grows slowly from 1980 until 2013. Then the blue line, the next one down, is South Asia. That's the area average that Afghanistan is in. And then the red line is the low category, which Afghanistan is also in. And all 3 of those sort of move along, and the whole world seems to be progressing slightly over time. And then the bottom one, the green one, is Afghanistan. Now we can see that up until about 1990, Afghanistan is on par with the levels of the world, and so we'd have to say the Soviet Union must have been maintaining, because they were in there until 1989, must have been maintaining the Human Development Index numbers at a pretty reasonable rate, doing some reasonable things as much as we dislike the Soviet Union. But then right after that, we have no data in between from 1990 to 2000, but by 2000 there is no upswing. So it stays flat, whereas the rest of the world kind of rises a bit. And that has to be because of the brutal civil war that happened after the Soviets left, and then the rise of the Taliban. Then, after that, the next numbers we have are for 2005, and the numbers are back up, and then they sort of seem to go back along the gentle rise that the world seems to be experiencing in improving human development. So we could say that, there's no denying the fact that the Western intervention has done something to put us back on that track. The problem is, as I'll try to show later, there is a ton of money that has gone into Afghanistan for the last 13 years. And it's gone in order, people say, to seed development so that the country can then develop on its own and be self-governing and self-sustainable. But many people are very worried that as soon as the intervention winds down, and it's winding down right now, and the money is withdrawn, that those numbers will collapse. And I'll give you some examples of that in a little while. I'll tell you one right now. So the Afghan National Armed Forces, the Army and the police, costs probably about $4 billion a year to run. But the total revenue for the country is about $1 billion. They couldn't even support their army. So all of that money comes from the West. So the rise depends to a great degree on Western money going in. And when that is withdrawn, the curve may collapse badly. But we don't know that yet. In essence, a G7 country like Canada, countries like the UK and the US who have spent tons of money there have done a lot of work and have not been able to lift the country out of being below the average of the bottom category. So I don't think there's a lot there to defend. Mr. Feita insists that he has been to Afghanistan many times and he sees development and he sees happiness and he sees things being changed in the country. He says, I can tell you from first-hand knowledge the lives of many millions of Afghans have improved during the past decade. Now, I haven't gone to Afghanistan. I'm too busy doing other stuff. I'd like to go. I'll try to figure out how to go one day. So what I do is I just look at various other first-hand accounts. And one of my favorites is Graham Smith, a good friend of mine. Graham wrote for the Globe and Mail during most of the war. He spent more time in southern Afghanistan than any other Western news reporter, and now he actually lives in Kabul, working for the International, Crisis Group. He's a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group. And in his book that came out last fall, the dogs are reading them now, he concluded that Afghanistan was an unsuccessful laboratory for ideas about how to fix a ruined country. At best, we are leaving behind an ongoing war. At worst, it's a looming disaster. In an interview I did with him a few months ago, he called it heartbreaking. And he spends a lot of time there. Let's just look at numbers of civilian deaths. So this is the period in which Mr. Feita took his 10 trips to Afghanistan. He said things were great, everyone was happy, things were moving ahead, millions of lives were being improved. But during that period, civilian deaths doubled. They went up every year in the conflict. These are only deaths. They don't include injuries, maiming. They're only reported deaths. They don't include displacements, lack of work, all kinds of things that occur because of a war. So it's difficult for me to understand how he could see everything was improving when at the same time it was actually getting twice as worse. We can look at the numbers updated, the most recent numbers we have updated till 2013. It looks like during the last 2 or 3 years things have leveled off. They certainly haven't gone down too far, but civilian deaths are sort of remaining at that high that was reached around 2010, 2011. And it could be the case that this will begin to level off and drop off, but I think I can show you later that it's not time to celebrate yet. This is a high level of violence in the country and not really something to be happy about. If you go to your Government of Canada website to see if you should travel to Afghanistan, I did it a couple of days ago just to check. It says, avoid all travel. It says, Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Canada advises against all travel to Afghanistan due to the unstable security situation, ongoing insurgency, terrorist attacks, and risk of kidnapping and a high crime rate. If you choose to travel to Afghanistan despite this warning, you are taking a serious risk. If you are already in Afghanistan, you should leave. The Embassy of Canada in Afghanistan's ability to provide consular and other support throughout the country is very limited. So I tried to get the U of T to let 4 research students and myself to go to Afghanistan last year, and they said no effing way.
In polite language.
Yes, very legalistic language actually, very legalistic. So there's a good 2014 U.S. Congress mandated independent assessment of the Afghan National Security Forces. It's worth reading. It's a big survey. It was mandated by Congress. They want to know what they should do as they leave the country. And one of their major conclusions is, we conclude that the security environment in Afghanistan will become more challenging after 2014. And the Taliban insurgency will become a greater threat to Afghanistan's stability in 2015-18. It's getting worse. It's not getting better. Thus, the Afghans have little in the way of accomplishments from the West to defend, and they have very serious challenges ahead. Against Mr. Feita's second argument, which is that the West will continue to support the mission and add more accomplishments, I think it's pretty easy to say that most Western populations want out of Afghanistan now. Just a couple of examples. 79% of Americans want to withdraw completely. 48% of Americans now say it was a complete mistake. That number has changed radically from something like 9% way back in 2001. So half the population now thinks it's a complete mistake, and most want out. So it's going to be hard to maintain support. The announcements of support that have happened in NATO summits, etc., have been extremely vague. So, one of the biggest names in international relations who's taken a serious interest in Afghanistan and published a whole ton of stuff on it, and I would not call a lefty. Mr. Cordesman, Anthony Cordesman, is not a lefty at all, but he has even become very skeptical, and he thinks that the U.S. is now going to try to succeed in Afghanistan with half measures on the cheap, which will be seriously inadequate, so the support is going down. He calls all the pronouncements about support to be mere guesstimates, and he also alleges that all official reporting on the war has been filled with too much spin and too many omissions to make it impossible to predict what's going on there now. And I was surprised to see, I think Reed found me that. Reed, he found me that quote. That was great. One of my ROP students, the document. Cordesman saying that is pretty serious. Now the U.S., until recently, very recently, what people talk about going into Afghanistan is $7 billion a month from the U.S. Okay? That's what it's been costing. Funding is likely to decrease drastically. If you look at all past interventions, at least the ones that I've seen statistics on in journal articles, as soon as the U.S. leaves, the funding goes way down, no matter what they say. The current guesstimate, to use Cordesman's language, is that we'll put $4 billion a year into the country, which will just support the military. That's it. And that is what, I don't know if I did the math on this, I think that's a 96% decrease in funding, which takes effect roughly December this year. So it's really anybody's guess whether that's going to lead to major accomplishments. Again, from the Congress-mandated independent assessment of the Afghan National Security Forces, they say that we conclude that a too rapid decline in funding, which looks like it's coming, is likely to result in another civil war in Afghanistan. Which is not a great accomplishment. I'm going to leave conditionality threats aside. U.S. force reductions, there were about 100,000 U.S. forces in at the peak. As of the spring this year, there were about 32,000. And in a few months, by January, there's supposed to be about 10,000. And they're supposed to only be training and advising. So this is a serious drop. I mean, 100,000 troops from the most powerful country of all time, operating in a country with amazing logistical, satellite, etc. support. To take those out is to take something serious out. I'm not saying they always did good things, but it's a major change in what's occurring in the country. There will be special forces in Afghanistan outside of those numbers to pursue the global war on terror, and we are never really told how many there are. They've always been there, and we don't know much about them. This is all dependent on signing the bilateral security agreement, which may happen in the next week or so. You should see that in the news. Finally, they found a possible president in the country. It had been held up for many months. So as those 90,000 U.S. soldiers leave, and the Canadians up to 3,000 left by the end of a few months ago. We had reached about 2,900, and then we were down to about 800, and then a few months ago we were out. All of these foreign forces are leaving. The Afghan National Security Forces have to take the lead, but it's at a cost. So over the conflict, 13,000 Afghan National Security Forces have been killed. The majority of those during the last 3 years. So in the fall of 2013, the Afghan National Security Forces started suffering casualty rates that a U.S. general said were similar to what we took in Vietnam. And that turns out to be, from the numbers I've been able to find, about 100 a week. So we have a report last week from an interior minister in Afghanistan, and he said that over the past 6 months, 6 months only, 1,523 police officers had been killed in blasts and clashes with insurgents. The attacks have also claimed the lives of 800 Afghan National Army soldiers. So in 6 months, that's 2,323 dead in the ANSF. The toll is pretty harsh. This is on top of the fact that until recently, it's been well reported that the Afghan National Army loses about 1/3 of its fighting force every single year through desertion, resignation, injury, or death. It is an unsustainable force. We hear numbers like 300,000 soldiers all the time, but really, they're trying to pump people into the system because they're going out of the system faster than they get them in. Beyond attrition, there are serious problems with the Afghan National Security Forces, serious problems. There's incredible brutality. Cases of torture are common. The corruption is unbelievable. We have House of Commons reports from a few years ago that show that if you wanted to be a police chief in a certain district in Afghanistan, you had to pay $50,000 to the power brokers, and you were only going to be paid a couple $100s a month to be the police chief. So what was that money doing? That money was buying into the drug cartels. If you wanted to be the police chief, you had to pay off the drug cartels, and then presumably you would make money off of that. Thus, in House of Commons reports, it's incredibly corrupt. One of the most disturbing things is that the ANSF, the Afghan National Security Forces, seem to be collaborating with the Taliban, the insurgency itself. So a survey in Kandahar and Helmand in 2010 found that 69% of respondents thought that soldiers were helping or would end up joining the insurgents. The number was 81% for police helping or joining the insurgents. It happens both ways. Sometimes the Taliban helps the army, and sometimes the army helps the Taliban in all kinds of ways to make money. It's going to be very difficult to maintain adequate levels of support, so I really don't think Feda's second argument works. Against his third argument that there's sufficient investment and economic development occurring in the country which will generate more accomplishments, we can say a couple of the following things. I tried to say this earlier. Real economic growth in Afghanistan is seriously restrained by corruption, the drug trade, and insecurity. One of the most interesting things I found in a House of Commons report is a little aside. About 6 years ago, maybe 2007, they said that there were three main threats to our mission in Afghanistan, the House of Commons committee on this. And the first threat, of course, was the Taliban, a serious threat to our mission in Afghanistan. The second threat was this cocktail of corruption, drug lords, and stuff like that, warlords that was threatening the mission. We would be trying to put in place some kind of governing structures that might be rife with corruption, and that might not work. Does anyone know what the third, not a student in my class, does anyone know what the third threat was? The third threat was the Canadian public. Because the Canadian public is fickle and turns its emotions on a dime and might not support the mission. You can find that in the House of Commons report. That's an aside. There is a real problem with economic growth in Afghanistan. It's seriously corrupt. Second issue is, I think one of my slides didn't come up there, but I'll get back to that anyways. The second thing is that really a lot of money has gone into the extractive industry in Afghanistan. So there are two major deposits, one of copper and one of iron in Afghanistan. These are world-class deposits, and people have thought that by opening up the mines to develop these two resource deposits, Afghanistan could get on a track of independent self-development. The Chinese have bought up the rights to the Ainak copper deposit, and the Indians have bought up the rights, with a small Canadian contingent in there, the Hajigak iron ore deposit. Now, really, there's been a lot of sort of touting about how these projects are going to move ahead and how they're going to help Afghanistan, but the projects are just rife with insecurity. The Chinese and the Indians are trying to renegotiate and put off actually having to get anything done there because it's too dangerous. No infrastructure is there for them to allow the projects to get going. They would have to build railways, roads, they have to truck in phosphate, they have to displace people. One of the projects is on one of the biggest ancient Buddha cities in the world, and they're going to start, bulldozing it, and then people are fighting for them not to bulldoze it. And the skinny is that these things are really a long way from ever getting going. It's just not viable, not yet. The major highway in Afghanistan is the Kabul-Kandahar highway between the two main cities, and the insurgents attack or stop convoys on that highway every day, 5 or 6 times a day. The World Bank has ranked Afghanistan the 164th easiest place to do business in the world. So I say if you want to do business, maybe pick in the top 50. Below that, Again, the UN is reporting that this year Afghanistan is likely to supply 90% of the world's opium. It has done that before. It is a narco state. So, really, the strategy in Afghanistan became coin or counterinsurgency. And the mantra was cash is a weapon. So the whole idea was we're going to go in and we're going to build stuff that the people like. So the people will then like us, and they will give us the insurgents. They'll say, oh, we like you. That guy's an insurgent. Go kill him. So it was a way to separate the people from the insurgents. A much harsher form of this strategy was used in Vietnam to separate the people from the insurgents. In that case, they just used like concentration camps. So we've developed so that we don't do that now. We try to use development projects and things like that. But the problem is, it meant we had to rush all of these projects with little accountability structures, and they were all organized by military people or overseen by military people because the security situation was so harsh you couldn't go do it if you were just an NGO. And so the projects were rushed. Many of them were not completed. There's no paper trail for many of them. Graham Smith, who I mentioned before, has told me stories about going to find out where CETA projects were, and the CETA project managers in Afghanistan could not point to a single project on a map so that he could go see it. But the money was pouring in. Projects were never completed. They failed because they didn't engage local knowledge. There's a great story about an American or a British, I can't remember, soldier who was put in charge of rebuilding a town. So he had never done that before, so he planned out a town, he built it up and put all the infrastructure in, and they came to check later, and he had put one of the main streets right across the airplane runway. And so it just didn't work. I mean, it's not a good idea. But he felt pretty proud of himself. That is dual purpose. Of course, many of the projects ended up lining the pockets of very corrupt partners. Tons of material on that. Corruption is rampant. As I said before, one of the signature projects is the Arghandab or Dala Dam, which Canada spent $50 million on. The other one is the Kajaki Dam, which the British largely tried to rebuild. These were dams built way back in the day of the Cold War in order to make the Helmand Desert a kind of land of plenty, a Garden of Eden. We had to rebuild them because the dams, not rebuild them, we had to like rebuild all the sluice gates and the irrigation canals and dredge the dam because the dam silts up and becomes useless every few years anyways. We tried to do all that work, but none of it got completed. Anyways, coins sort of failed to convince most Afghans. Everyone says that Afghanistan itself is largely a rural country. It's not like Iraq, a very sort of urban country. Most of the population is out in the hinterland, and the country is, is cut up by mountains and desert. It's very rural, and there isn't a lot of interconnection between all of the disparate rural peoples. And they have never felt that the central government from Kabul is their government, right? So when a bunch of Westerners came in with flak jackets, 20-year-old guys from Wyoming with guns saying, we'll build you a bazaar, and then you listen to Hamid Karzai, you can find stuff like this online where they document it. The people are just freaked out, they're not interested, and they don't sign on. There's some good frontline documentaries that show how that didn't happen, how it happened badly. And so it just wasn't going to work. The guy who's been sort of most critical on this turns out to have been the leader of all of Western forces in Afghanistan during the first part of the surge, and then he became the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. And basically in a foreign affairs article last fall, he said, in short, coin failed in Afghanistan. That's Carl Eichenberry. Thus, economic development has been very disappointing. The fourth argument, the last one that Mr. Fatah puts forward, is the one I put last because the election is happening now, or it's just happened. It's hard to say. Democratic processes may mature around the 2014 presidential elections, which would be a major accomplishment. So the current presidential election, I say current because although it was held on April 5th, just before the summer, the problem was that the 8 contenders, not one of them got 50% of the vote. So then they have a runoff between the top 2. The guy who won the most vote but not 50% was Abdullah. Okay? So now they had to have a runoff vote on June 14th between Abdullah and the guy who got the second most votes, which was Ashraf Ghani. So Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, where they voted for them in the runoff on June 14th. But only a couple of days ago was a winner selected. Okay? So what happened is Abdullah got more votes in the first vote. Ashraf Ghani got more votes in the runoff. So then Abdullah said, you guys were ballot stuffing, and if the Independent Elections Commission says Ashraf Ghani is the winner, I'm going to fight. Okay, so he wasn't going to. So then John Kerry from the United States had to go over and broker a deal. So we got them to say, okay, what we'll do is we'll have a vote count and we'll see how the votes worked out, and you guys will agree that whoever seems to have won through the independent vote count will be the winner, but the other guy will get like a second in command seat in the government. So that's what happened, and like a few weeks ago we started to hear rumors that Ashraf Ghani won by quite a bit. So Abdullah said, there's no way you're allowed to release the numbers until we sign the deal where I get to be second in command. So that deal was signed, I think, on Sunday or Saturday, finally. And so now we have this weird process where the U.S. has intervened to help these two guys figure out how they can control the country instead of allowing the democratic voice to work perfectly. And that's because Abdullah commands a large amount of power in northern Afghanistan, Tajiks and Hazara areas, and Ashraf Ghani commands a lot of power in the Pashtun areas in the south. And if they don't figure out a way to get along, they will fight, and there will be another civil war. So they have a kind of brinksmanship going on, and the power agreement, which has been released, you can read it. It's really hard to see how it could possibly work. It looks like they almost get equal amounts of power in various different ways throughout, and a whole new thing has to be put in on top of the Constitution to allow it to be legal, and the U.S. has said it's a good thing to do. And it looks like now we will never be told the numbers on what happened in the runoff election. The Independent Election Commission's officer said there were hundreds of thousands of fraudulent ballots on both sides, on each side, which is better than the 2009 election where there were probably 2 or 3 million fraudulent ballots. Is this democracy? I don't think so. Another thing about the democracy issue in Afghanistan is the Taliban did not participate, right? They disrupted the election with violence. So we know that 26 police officers were killed during the election, 20 civilians were killed during the election, 60 insurgents were killed during the election, and 100 polling stations were closed for the entire day. We know that. We don't know a lot else, but the Taliban was not interested in participating. They were interested in disrupting. Everyone says that there will be no military solution in Afghanistan. It has to be a political solution. But the individuals that cause the biggest trouble in Afghanistan the way it is the insurgency. They're the main contesters for power. But they're not being included in the vote, right? So an election is a political process. The people who you want to get into the political process are the Taliban, and they're saying no deal. Why are they saying no deal? Because everyone's leaving. The US is leaving, Canada's leaving, Britain's leaving. They think they're going to win. They don't think they're going to lose. So democracy is going to be an iffy thing if it happens at all. And I've already quoted this before. I think it looks like, according to the Congress-mandated report, that things are going to get worse in Afghanistan. Everyone starts to believe that now, at least in the 2015-2018 timeframe. I want to say that elections are really a story we've told about democracy in Afghanistan. Okay? The elections didn't include the Taliban, which are the chief rivals for power in Afghanistan, so it's not a political solution, it's not a democratic issue there. And you know, this is a group that NATO, after 13 years, could not destroy. So it's a powerful force. They were largely fraudulent, as I've said. There was a lot of violence going on. And if we look at Transparency International, which is a group that tries to assess corruption in countries, things like that, democratic values in countries, for the last 2 years, it has said Afghanistan, North Korea, and Somalia are the tied worst corrupt countries on the planet. So the elections take place in the context of violence, fraud, and absolute corruption. This is not an accomplishment of democracy. Elections take place in the most corrupt country on earth. This is not much of an accomplishment. So we know from a 2008 document leaked from the British that the British thought the best thing we could do in Afghanistan would be to get an acceptable dictator within a 10-year period or so. And I think, basically we're moving in that direction. If we can get some strong men to run this 300,000 man military supported by $4 billion from the West every year, while all of the development projects, etc., are let go, we'll be happy enough. And that's what it looks like it's heading to be. So Mr. Fatah closes, and I'll close. He says, our collective goal should be to ensure that there is no significant backsliding from Afghanistan's direction towards some limited degree of self-sustainability and self-governance. We should try to make sure they don't slip back from what they've achieved in terms of self-sustainability and self-governance. But really, there is no self-governance there. It's not a democratic state. It's a state of powerful forces, one side of the forces supported by Western money, another side fighting with all kinds of other weird issues, and even the election is hugely problematic. So you can't slip back much farther from that. On self-sustainability, I'll just say the thing about the money again. The annual revenue for the whole of Afghanistan, discounting the drug trade, is about $1 billion, and their army costs $4 billion a year to run. So if they can't even support half of their army, let alone all of the other services that a country would need to support. So this means it's not self-sustainable. If we were taking the measure of self-sustainability seriously, we would say that actually before 2001, the country was more sustainable under the Taliban, economically more viable, which is a crazy thing to say. I don't want to support the Taliban, but we can't use that as a real measure today. So this is Afghanistan. Really, it sort of works out. This is a kind of a simplification of the map, but the yellow area is area that the Taliban controlled just before they were kicked out in 2001, and the green and pink areas are the Northern Alliance areas, which were the areas in which the strongest warlords who fought against the Soviets held on. And in a way, that's where we're now. We are there now, because really, Abdullah is friends with the green and red area, and the yellow area is more dominated by the Pashtun people, which is kind of Ashraf Ghani area. Mr. Fatah believes that if these two guys can hold hands and make a deal, the whole country will be in a kind of unity position and everything will get better. But really, the country is torn apart by tribal, sub-tribal allegiances that divide the country because it's incredibly rural. There has never been a centralized government. The terrain is really difficult and it exacerbates those divisions. There is no infrastructure. It's, as everyone likes to say, medieval. Approximately 80% of Afghan's population is in sort of the subsistence sector on the land, so they're prey to the world's leading opium industry and the warlords and drug lords that make that happen. And that is intimately connected to weapons, and the weapons and the drug lords and the insurgency work out deals, so that's not going to go away. And so it's a place in which local and regional power brokers abound. It's not a place in which two guys can shake hands and the whole unity government is going to make Afghanistan better. People called Hamid Karzai the mayor of Kabul for his entire tenure, the president of Afghanistan, because he has no reach outside of Kabul. And the same will be for the unity government. That's where I'll wrap it up and open up for questions. Thank you very much.